CGTN, China Global Television Network.
According to a UNICEF report, 100 million children in Africa were not in school prior to the onset of COVID-19. The pandemic further exacerbated the situation, with school closures impacting an additional 250 million students. In addition to the coronavirus, various other factors contribute to the challenges of providing universal education in Africa, including poverty, accessibility, and poor infrastructure. January the 24th is the International Day of Education, with the theme Changing Course, Transforming Education, and has been set aside with a view to addressing some of the challenges to education in an evolving world. This week on the program, we look at how Africa's education systems can adapt to ensure everyone's fundamental right to education is realized while providing the skills required in a changing job market. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, as the COVID pandemic swept across the world, causing mass school closures, Africa's education systems were impacted like never before. But Africa's inherent challenges have made an already difficult situation even more precarious. Before we begin our discussion, my colleague Isabel Nakiria looks at some of the issues affecting education in Uganda today.
Madina Bukirwa is now a shop attendant in Kampala after dropping out of school in the senior 2 grade. Her family couldn't afford her education after a poor farm harvest. But Madina is hurt because her dad chose to pay fees for her elder brother over her.
My elder brother was in senior 4. Dad was paying for him and for me too, and yet there are other children in primary school. Then he told me, since your brother is in a higher class, let me pay for him and he completes his course. As for you, go look for a job.
Madina hopes to save some money and learn skills in hairdressing. Millions of boys and girls like her in sub-Saharan Africa will not complete their primary and secondary education by 2030, says a new UN report. Uganda is among countries that need to do more to improve learning in public schools. Uganda offers free education in public schools, but parents top up a small fee for food and stationery material. Public schools are also congested, affecting the standards of education. The UN says many countries like Uganda are failing to meet their commitments in giving quality education.
In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, only 2 out of 3 children will be completing 1 year of preschool, even though the target is, of course, for all of them to do so. We also see that maybe not even all children will be achieving primary school, which is a target that the world had already set for 2015.
The report points at increasing poverty levels in Africa, conflict, ill health in children, and spending less on their budgets in education, which is delaying their academic development. The closure of schools globally due to the pandemic has also been a major concern for the UN. Uganda just reopened schools after close to 2 years.
We know that children who learn from a distance do not benefit equally from these conditions. There are major challenges to be overcome, and of course we know that for the majority of children in sub-Saharan Africa, distance education has not really worked because children lack the resources to be continuing the learning.
Other countries with very low completion rates in education are Tanzania, Somalia, and Zimbabwe. The UN is urging countries not to lose hope, but pay urgent attention to improving learning at all levels of education. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN Kampala, Uganda.
And joining me now to unpack the challenges to education in Africa from Paris, Manos Antoninis, Director of the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report, Professor Jacqueline Batchelor, Associate Professor in Digital Learning at the University of Johannesburg, and from Lagos in Nigeria, I'm joined by Dr. Mo Adifeso Olatuju, Managing Director of the Education Partnership Center in Nigeria. Thank you all very much for joining in this discussion, and welcome to Talk Africa. Now, a global shutdown, a global pandemic shut down many sectors of the global economy over the last 2 years and left the education sector equally reeling. First off, let me start off with you, Dr. Olatuju, if I may. Paint for us a picture of the impact this has had overall in the education sector in Africa.
Well, thank you so much for the question. I think that the pandemic, the first thing to say, is one of those occurrences that is just so unprecedented. And what it did was to highlight across the world, and of course in Africa as well, the level of our lack of preparation when it came to dealing with crisis at scale, indeed of a global proportion. And I remember conducting a study right in, I think it was March 2020, beginning that study right as the pandemic was announced, and reflecting on the data about 2 months later, recognizing that 1.2 billion learners were effectively out of school. And so the whole notion of what it meant to be a child out of school was totally redefined, by this pandemic. There was a point at which even 73.8% of the world's school population was affected by school closures. And in Nigeria, 0.4 million learners did not have the opportunity to receive regular education. I mean, obviously, children not having access to learning opportunities meant that we had significant levels of learning loss that we are still trying to come to grips with. We had issues around the protection of girls, in particular, as a gender that's already disadvantaged. I think that the scale of the damage is really one that we're still grappling with.
So I do want to look at that scale of damage, because you've mentioned one thing about highlighting the level of lack of preparedness. Talk to us about that lack of preparedness, particularly when it comes to the African situation.
I think that one of the key challenges that we faced within the context of Africa was a significant lack of investment in technology. And when I say technology, I'm not just referring to sophisticated online technology, but even the basic kind of technologies that enable children to learn at a distance. And so we began to see a huge scramble in many countries to introduce instructional radio, for example, opportunities for children to learn by radio. We began to see more efforts being placed on the ability of children to receive learning packets that were then supplemented by SMS messaging to their parents and to their caregivers. So I think that for me, the most important lack of investment really was in the sort of technologies that are appropriate, the sort of technologies that would be able to help children learn, whether they were in a physical building called a school or within the context of another learning environment.
Let me rope in Manos here, because Manos, according to a UN report on the state of the global education crisis, which is looking particularly in low and middle income countries, the share of children living in learning poverty was already at 53% before the pandemic, and could potentially reach 70% as a result of the pandemic. What short-term impact has this had on the education sector?
Well, the impact of the pandemic globally is really extremely significant. The one thing one may say in the case of sub-Saharan Africa is that we should not forget that the situation was already quite problematic before the onset of the pandemic. In sub-Saharan Africa, only 3 out of 10 children by the end of primary school could reach the minimum levels of proficiency in reading and mathematics. And actually, the latest survey that we have had by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics that compared 6 countries' performance in reading and mathematics at the end of primary before and after the pandemic, in fact shows no impact. But what does that mean? It means that the levels of learning were so low that the pandemic has not really affected that situation. And that's the big picture for Africa that we should not forget. And maybe we should also say that on top of that, very few children really had access to distance learning opportunities. We don't have enough data on that. The best source of information, because most data sources broke down, the best source of information is some phone surveys, which in themselves have some problems, but they have shown, for instance, that very few children had access to, let's say, their mobile phone for learning.
And Professor Bachelor, of course, she's a mobile learning specialist here. And I mean, listening to the challenges that the two speakers have talked about there, you know, how apt is, you know, the theme for this year's International Education Day? I mean, which is talking about changing course. Do we need to change course at this point?
I think we were forced to change course really rapidly, redirect in a new direction. The whole advent, as was mentioned earlier, just using multimodal means to reach every learner through radio, through TV, through mobile. There was really a collaborative effort to make sure that that no learner is left behind. But in doing so, we almost really reduced the impact of the curriculum. We had to really present a lean curriculum to strip it down to really the bare essence. So there was really an interrogation of what is actually the core in the curriculum. What are those skills, attitudes, values that need to be carried forward to really enable a learner to progress and to offer a future pathway to either re-enter the schooling information or system at a later stage, or to actually progress to a next level. So the opportunities for using new technologies only go so far in terms of the infrastructure readiness of a particular region. You can only deliver solutions if there's sophisticated systems in place to actually support it.
Right. Dr. Olataju, let's look at that changing course for the moment and look at what Professor Bachelor is talking about. I mean, we need the infrastructural technology if we are to change course. Where are we when it comes to Africa at this particular point? Talking about transformation, what is there to transform? How do we transform if we don't have the infrastructure, the technological infrastructure?
I think in answering that question, the first response is, what do we have in our hands already? I think firsthand, in the first place, one of the most significant aspects of value that I would attribute to this terrible, terrible pandemic is that it has caused a waking up within the context of African nations, a waking up to the reality that the world has changed and it is not going to go back to what it was before. And so what does that tell us, for example, when it comes to how to deliver learning? I think that some of the transformations that we're already seeing, and I work a lot in the space of innovation, is incredibly remarkable. Many of these innovations are still small scale, pilot phase, emerging type of innovations. But I think that they're significantly remarkable in how they're able to bridge the gap, that learning gap for children, including children who have been excluded for a very long time from learning. So I think that we're already beginning to see transformation when it comes to how we think about innovation. We're already beginning to see transformation also, even in how the public and the private sectors think about collaborating. I think that the conversations around inclusion are also coming to the fore, and what it means to be excluded at a time when every child pretty much was excluded from learning. And so sharpening our focus on children who by nature of their gender or a disability or by poverty are excluded from the system. And those conversations are coming to the fore again in terms of what exactly we should be doing.
And I come back to you, Professor Bachelor. When we talk about what do we have on the ground, practically from where you sit, what do we have?
We're seeing a pattern where there's multiple stakeholders that previously didn't work together, that are coming together to jointly try and resolve these really complex solutions. And that's really encouraging to see. We have publishers that are waiving copyright to make the material freely available. We have, universities that are donating time, effort through their students to try and find innovative solutions, and in that way creating pathways to job creation. We have, these unintended consequences of whichever solutions are being put forward. If you are trying to reach a child through a mobile learning app or through a mobile learning device, usually that is mediated through an adult that might also be facing certain challenges and had learning deficits through their own career. And we see that those are also the unintended consequences is that schooling has become available to a broader society outside of just the learners that are in the school environment. And that is something that we're also picking up. That,
right.
it's becoming visible. We through these innovations, we are making learning visible on a scale that has never been possible before. We're opening up the classrooms to parents, to caregivers, and that is really encouraging.
Mano, so there seems to be a lot of innovation that has had to go into the education sector over the last 2 years. But if you look at Africa's education sector, it was already quite vulnerable and facing a major funding deficit. Now, aid to education is also estimated to fall by up to $2 billion in 2022. How has this pandemic amplified the traditional challenges that have already in the past been existing in the education sector?
There is often a misunderstanding about the funding gaps in Africa. There is a very important fact to keep in mind, precisely because there are so many young people in the continent. In fact, Africa allocates the largest share of its budget to education than any other region, and that's appropriate. The big problem is that governments are not raising enough domestic resources to fund their programs. And that's why, by contrast, the share of education spending as a percentage of the gross domestic product is very low, among the lowest. So that's a big challenge that the world encounters, and that's why we still have the discussion whether external financial assistance can step in and help. And it's true, in some countries, governments practically only fund salaries and some operational costs, but all the innovations, all the investments, all the attempts to transform education systems end up often being funded externally. That's why we keep maintaining an attention to the aid as a factor of support. Unfortunately, over the years, aid has remained a constant share of what rich countries transfer to developing countries. And we don't see a clear indication that this is going to change. And given the financial crisis that also the global north went through, we do expect that at least for the next few years, maybe the levels of support will decline. We saw that also the big problem of lack of solidarity to the global south in the case of vaccines. So you can imagine that this problem also can extend to education in some way, despite efforts that have been observed.
All right, we're going to leave it there for the moment and continue with this discussion. For now, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll explore the different ways that Africa can address some of these challenges and transform education across the continent. Stay with us. Welcome back to the program. Still with me in this discussion, Manos Antoninis, Professor Jacqueline Batchelor, and Dr. Mo Adefeso Olateju. Before the break, we looked at some of the challenges to universal education in Africa today. Let's now look at some possible solutions to this. Dr. Olateju, you know, school closures and lockdowns have deeply affected the education sector. I mean, and it has created a huge gap in the way we provide education, particularly in Africa. You know, what are some of the major transformations that will have far-reaching repercussions into the foreseeable future? What have we learned here?
I think that, first of all, it's very important to redefine the notion of the school and the classroom. And I know that this is an area where governments and the public sector is very uncomfortable very often, to address. But I think that the pandemic has shown us very clearly that if we are going to help children to develop the sorts of skills that will enable them to have a sustainable livelihood in the future, then we are going to have to go back to being child-centered. And that means that the fundamental questions that we're asking are not what is good for the education sector, but what is good for the child. And the locus of education, the locus of the learning pursuit, will need to be redefined in a lot of contexts. Now, of course, school is going to continue to be important because, as we know, school is not just a space where children have an opportunity to receive an education, but school also has a very important welfare and also child protection function, that it performs. And that must continue to exist. But we must also recognize, and we are, I think, as a continent, beginning to see more clearly that the local learning will need to change. I think, again, as mentioned, slightly earlier, the notion of technology and rethinking how we invest in different types of technology in accordance with the need of the child is, again, a conversation that policymakers are really going to have to roll up their sleeves and address, I think, in the near future.
Right, Manos, that whole question of the learners that have been left behind, and we do know that often in Africa, this is a real situation, and particularly, during this pandemic season when many learners did not have access to the technological solutions that other countries in the West particularly did have. Because according to UNICEF, during the pandemic period, about 250 million Africans were impacted by these disruptions. How do you build back better education systems, though, that were adversely affected during the pandemic?
Well, I tried to deflect a little the attention from the pandemic, considering that what we had before the pandemic was not, in a good condition. I think both Jacqueline and Mo have drawn attention to this tension that exists and which is really difficult for African education systems to grapple with. African governments really aspire for development, economic development and growth based on skills, high-level skills, professional skills. But at the same time, when we have 7 out of 10 children finishing primary school, and that's only those that finish primary school, right? Because we should remember that 1 in 3 children in Africa do not finish primary school. Then the question is, well, we should care about those. And it's a matter of equity and inclusion. We need to care about these 8, almost 9 out of 10 children in the continent that do not have the opportunity by the age of finishing primary school, and that's also actually they finish sometimes very late, to basically understand a text and comprehend the questions that emerge from such a text. We're talking about really a very difficult challenge. And the question is for African governments to also consider this issue, own up to it, and tackle it in their own means. But it is really a priority of equity. And that is where we want to see the systems being built back better.
All right. Even as we talk about the question of equity, Dr. Olateju, I mean, what Manos is talking about, development of high-level skills, because, we've seen massive job losses, particularly in the last 2 years. But even then, in Africa, education hasn't exactly been a solution or a guarantor to employment. Experts have been pointing out to this disconnect between the education system and the eventual, job market, what you find in the job market. Is it time for a curriculum rethink? What should we be focusing on?
Is it time for a curriculum rethink? 10 years ago, it was time for a curriculum rethink. So yes, it is time for a curriculum rethink. I think that it's very urgent now. The world that we live in today, whether it was facilitated by the pandemic or not, the reality of it is that we're moving into an age that is very different from any of the ages that have been experienced, in humanity. In today's parlance and with today's young people, we are looking, very closely at concepts around, artificial intelligence, even in education, the Internet of Things with devices talking to each other. We're looking at the reality of technology like we have never seen it before. And what is this going to create? It's going to create a situation, it has indeed already begun to create a situation where many more jobs are fungible than had been previously in a continent like Africa. And then, when we couple, the reality that jobs are fungible with the truth that I think Manos has espoused quite clearly, that children in school are not learning. Even before the pandemic, they were not learning. So if that doesn't point to an urgent rethink of how we design our curriculum systems and what we focus on, then I don't know what else is going to. I'm going to add one more layer onto that, and that is immigration. And we're seeing massive exit, from a lot of countries, the exit of skilled professionals, actually, skilled young people with a lot of significant potential, exiting, for the global West and countries, around the world. What does all this point to? It means that if Africa and African countries are going to continue to serve their people, if they're going to continue to, in one way or another, have a voice at the table, right, then we have to rethink how curriculum is done. And how does that begin? I think it begins with an honest reflection on nation states and where nation states are going and what nation states want to become. And then we work our way backward into the skills and the values and the competencies that we want our people to have. And then we begin to resource it in a way that we have never done before.
Let me rope in Professor Bachelor here, because we talk about the sort of skills that could be appropriate for our young people in Africa particularly. I mean, we are talking today about a world that is engaging or going through the fourth industrial revolution. How do you think our young people, though, should, or our young job seekers should adapt to this changing environment?
I think the point has been made that, borders as we've known them before has become very blurred and are disappearing. A child in Africa can easily connect to the rest of the world through a mobile device, through a desktop, and be engaged in a workforce elsewhere. So I think we need to rethink how our curriculums are shaped to allow our learners to cross these virtual borders. And I think that's one aspect. The second aspect is, even though we turn our gaze to the fourth industrial revolution and the new curricula such as robotics, computational thinking, coding, that is increasingly being included in curricula across Africa, it is important not to lose focus of those that never have the opportunity to even be included or to step into schooling in the first place, or that leave schooling early. On the one hand, yes, we can focus on all of these innovations and these new job opportunities. But on the other hand, those that are lost along the way, they become a burden to society in a way that they don't have any of those opportunities available to them. So we need to simultaneously focus on those that we are trying to create opportunities for, but also not leave and not lose our focus on the ones that are not developing the basic skills needed for reading, writing, arithmetic. So I think you almost need to have dual vision in a way, right, to be forward thinking, but also to be backward looking, to see what are you leaving behind, because it's not one against the other. It's not being polarized, but I think it is about a dual purpose that we need to just keep in mind.
All right, so I want to get a winding up comment from all of you, and I'll start off with you, Manos, because we've talked a lot about the issues of equity, the issues of access, the issues of disparities, between those who have access and those who do not. I mean, how can we now restore confidence in the education system?
I think in many parts of the world, that was one of the silver linings, as we say, of the pandemic. I think people, parents, governments recognized the contribution that the education system and teachers in particular are making to social and economic life. So we have to take that into account. But we also know, and that's particularly in the context of Africa, that equity as a preoccupation of policymakers has not been at a very high position. Just a last statistic, that's our job, to share statistics with you. In sub-Saharan Africa, only 1 in 4 young people finish secondary school, when the global goal is all of them to finish by 2030. But only 2 of the poorest girls living in rural areas, 2 out of 100, finish secondary school. You understand what is the scale of the challenge that we have ahead? And that's why policymakers who so far have been spending resources without appropriate, let's say, concern about whether that money, those resources, go to those who may need them more, are going. So that attitude, that approach to how public resources are spent and whether they're spent for the benefit of the most vulnerable needs to change. And we don't need the pandemic to tell us that. Policymakers in every country need to have that as a priority.
All right, and I think that's all we have time for on this edition of the program. But thank you all very much for your contribution, a very lively discussion indeed. A big thank you to our guest, Manos Antoninis, Director of the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report, Professor Jacqueline Bachelor, Associate Professor in Digital Learning at the University of Johannesburg, and Dr. Mo Adifeso Olatuju, Managing Director of the Education Partnership Center in Nigeria. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also catch the program on our YouTube playlist. To keep this conversation going, and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.